Today's episode is about the first ever computer animated feature film, Toy Story. It's a story of Silicon Valley innovation, Hollywood storytelling, and one man's 25-year journey to change how movies are made.
Toy Story isn't just a kids' movie. It's the origin story of Pixar and how a scrappy startup used computer graphics to reshape an entire industry. In this episode, expect to learn about the relationship between art and technology, how ambitious creative projects actually get done, and how you can become a better leader by removing barriers to creativity.
People say you have to have a lot of passion for what you're doing, and it's totally true. And the reason is because it's so hard that if you don't, any rational person would give up.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
This is Project Blueprint, the stories of legendary projects and the leaders behind them.
Stephen, one concept that I'm really interested in is the relationship between art and technology. So far on this podcast, we've talked about projects that have had creative elements, but in Toy Story, the creativity is front and center. So on this one, I'm really excited to dive into the story and understand how creative projects are accomplished and how we can apply this knowledge to our own work. So the question we're going to try to answer on this episode is, how do you lead a creative project that's part art, part technology?
I love that question, Will, and I'm also really excited to talk about these leadership lessons.
Steve Jobs once said, "Pixar's seen by a lot of folks as an overnight success. But if you look really closely, most overnight successes took a long time." So to really understand Toy Story, we need to go back to the beginning, before Woody, Buzz, or even Pixar. Back to the 1960s, where a high school student named Ed Catmull is standing at a crossroads in life. He's just graduated and is struggling to decide, like a lot of us, on what he wants to study in college. And Ed Catmull has these two conflicting passions. The first is cartoon animation, and the second is physics. And this might seem like a strange pairing, but it reveals two important sides of Catmull's personality. One is a love for art and animation, and the other is an interest in science and how the world works. Ed Catmull grew up in Salt Lake City, Utah, in a middle-class suburban family, and he kind of has an academic look to him. He's lanky with gold-rimmed glasses and a beard, and he's also kind of geeky. He enjoys reading research papers in his free time and prefers listening to talking. And growing up, Catmull had two heroes based on these two interests that he has. The first was Walt Disney, and the second was Albert Einstein. And he said, quote, "I remember watching one of the Wonderful World of Disney programs where the animators were drawing on the desk, and right there, the characters came to life on the desk. I knew that it was an illusion, but there was just something magical about it. I couldn't imagine anything better than being an animator. At the same time, I really liked science and math, and back then, the image of the scientist was Albert Einstein." So Ed Catmull has these two heroes, and he really admires Walt Disney because Disney incorporated technological breakthroughs into his own company and understood how technology could be used to create new types of art. But in high school, Ed Catmull thought he wasn't talented enough to be an animator, and ultimately he decided to pursue physics over animation. He said, quote, "I wanted to be the best in the world at something, and at the time, I couldn't see a path to becoming a great animator. I didn't have mentors or teachers to explain how you progress." So even though he chooses to pursue physics over animation, he never loses that dream of becoming an animator. Ed Catmull went on to graduate from the University of Utah in 1969 with a dual degree in physics and computer science. And after graduating, he moved to Seattle, and Stephen, guess where he took a job at?
Where did he take a job at, Will?
At Boeing.
Oh, wow.
In 1969. So for anyone who listened to our episode on the 747, this will sound very familiar because Catmull actually joined as the 747 was finishing production and he got caught up in the mass layoffs following Boeing's financial troubles and their big bet on the 747. So this was during the same period when that billboard went up that said, "Will the last person leaving Seattle please turn out the lights?" And on that episode, we talked about Boeing had to lay off so many people, and Ed Catmull was actually one of them. So kind of a crazy reference to the Project Blueprint expanded universe there.
Yeah. Wow.
Now, after being laid off from Boeing, Catmull returned to the University of Utah and decided to pursue graduate studies in computer science. And Stephen, in the early 70s, the University of Utah was at the heart of the computer revolution. Utah was one of the first universities to connect to the original ARPANET, which became the precursor to the internet. And specifically, Utah's computer science program had become the preeminent center for computer graphics research. And computer graphics are basically using software to create 2D or 3D images on a computer screen. And Catmull's exposure to these computer graphics research at Utah would go on to inspire his life's work. After his first graduate course, he immediately realized that computer graphics might allow him to pursue his dream of animation after all. He realized he could blend his two loves of animation and computer science to create a new type of animation, one that no one has ever seen before. And Catmull describes this revelation in a book we used for the research called To Infinity and Beyond by Karen Pike. And he says, "I was intending at the time to work on computer languages, but my first grad course was a computer graphics course. As soon as I took the first class, I just fell in love with it. It blew everything else away. Here was a program in which there was art, science, and programming all together in one place in a new field, and it was wide open. It was like being at an Easter egg hunt where you're at the front of the line."
Wow, that's really cool that he kind of finds his way back to his original dream.
Yeah, but the current state of computer animation is very primitive. Remember, we're in the early 70s here. And at the time, the lab at Utah was one of the only places in the world even doing computer graphics research. And computers could barely even draw a smooth curve. The graphical user interface, which is basically this windowed interface that we're all familiar with, where we can use a mouse to input commands, that hadn't even been invented yet. So the inputs to draw an image were still actually typed out in computer code. But even at this early stage, Catmull sees the potential of computer graphics. He believes one day computer graphics may improve enough to animate a feature-length movie. So, Stephen, here we have the beginning to one of our answers to the question of how you accomplish a creative project. And that's, you must have the patience and courage to stick to your vision. So here, Catmull is just starting to form his vision. In his book, Creativity, Inc., he said, "At the age of 26, I set a new goal, to develop a way to animate, not with a pencil, but with a computer, and to make the images compelling and beautiful enough to use in movies. Perhaps, I thought, I could become an animator after all." So Catmull has this vision, but it's going to take tremendous patience and courage for him to actually achieve this.
Especially given the state of technology at the time, if you had to literally draw with a computer, I mean, how audacious a vision that is, given the limited tool set at the time.
Exactly, and it's really only a vision that Catmull himself can see, because for a traditional animator that's used to animating with paper and pencil, this is completely unintuitive that you would actually type commands into a computer to draw an image on the computer screen. But Catmull, with his love of animation and computers, is able to see this before anyone else. But it also just speaks to how long it's going to be before this vision can become a reality. Catmull would say, quote, "I was completely in love with this notion of making things move and making them look good, and my goal was to develop the technology to the point where it could be used in feature films. I figured it would probably take 10 years to solve the problems that were in the way of making computer graphics useful for films. I was off by a factor of 2. It took 20.
Wow, no kidding.
So it's going to be 20 years before Catmull can realize this vision, but he's so inspired that he takes the first baby steps to make it a reality. For his dissertation, he focused on solving the problem of how to draw a smoothly curved surface on a computer, which obviously is a very basic problem you're going to need to solve if you're going to try to make any sort of animation or anything that looks good on a computer. So he recreated a plaster cast of his hand as a 3D model, and he animated it opening and closing. And this was actually one of the first ever computer animations. But computer graphics are not the only thing that Catmull learns at Utah. For the first time, he was also exposed to a culture that encouraged creativity and innovation. Because this field of computer graphics was so primitive, the department developed an environment where professors worked with grad students as peers in advancing the field. So students were welcomed to the program, given access to a computer, and then really let free to pursue whatever they were interested in. And actually, many of Catmull's classmates at Utah went on to be pioneers in the field of computer graphics. John Warnock co-founded graphic arts company Adobe. Alan Kay pioneered object-oriented programming and developed the first graphical user interface. And Nolan Bushnell founded Atari and kickstarted the video games industry. So the University of Utah is really the epicenter for all this computer graphics talent here in the early 70s. And Catmull's biggest takeaway from his time at Utah was the example his teachers provided for how to lead creative thinkers, and it inspired him to recreate that same culture after he left.
Wow, so some pretty incredible companies and ideas coming out of the University of Utah. I didn't know that this was sort of the epicenter. That's really interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting that when you have a new technology or a new paradigm like this, it usually starts with such a small group of people that everyone kind of knows each other at the beginning. Catmull graduated with his PhD in 1974, and as you can imagine, he's excited to continue working towards his ultimate goal of making a computer animated film. So he interviewed with several companies, but no one was interested in having him work on computer graphics. The field was just too primitive, and no one but Catmull could see the promise of computer animation. So with no other options, Catmull accepted a job at a computer-aided design company, but he was working on 2D graphics, not the 3D graphics he knew would be needed for a film one day. So Catmull's 29, and you've got to imagine he's feeling pretty depressed at this point. He had discovered this amazing opportunity to combine his two loves of animation and computers, but now he's just trapped in a mundane job, counting time, and really with no clear path to advance his dream of a computer animated film.
So it feels really back and forth for Catmull. I mean, he kind of starts his education thinking that he'll never be able to get to do animation. And then he gets this amazing opportunity, his PhD program, things are looking up, that he might actually be able to do this as a career. And now it feels like we're back to square one, Will.
But remember what I said earlier, to stick to your vision, you have to have patience. So Catmull's patiently waiting when one day he gets this mysterious call from a woman who said she was calling to book his flight. And of course, Catmull has no clue what she's talking about. And he says, "I'm sorry, like, what is this about?" And so she actually says, "Oh, sorry, somebody else is supposed to call you," and hangs up. And then moments later, Catmull got a call from the president of New York Institute of Technology, Alexander Schur. And Alexander Schur was a successful entrepreneur, and he was in the process of establishing a computer graphics research lab on Long Island. His goal was to create some digital tools to replace the labor-intensive task of hand-drawn animation. And he had asked around for recommendations on who could lead this lab, and a professor at the University of Utah had recommended Ed Catmull. When he asked Catmull if he was interested in leading the lab, of course, he accepts right away, because this is finally the opportunity to pursue his dream, and he'll have his own lab devoted to computer animation.
Okay, so he gets a lucky break again.
Yeah, so his dream is back on, and he moves to the lab in a renovated garage on Long Island and began the work of putting together this talented core of researchers who could lay the groundwork for a computer animated film. And to start, he tries to recreate the culture from Utah's computer science program that he had found so conducive to innovation. Some of Ed Catmull's first hires were employees of Xerox's Palo Alto Research Center, or Xerox PARC. And at the time, Xerox PARC was another leader in computer graphics research. It was here that Alan Kay would go on to develop the graphical user interface. But at this time, several employees had recently left Xerox after they ended research on color graphics. And one of these employees from Xerox PARC was a graphics researcher from Texas with a loud laugh named Alvy Ray Smith. And it's interesting to me, Stephen, because Catmull initially had conflicting feelings about hiring Alvy Ray Smith. Smith had this bold personality and actually seemed more qualified to lead the lab than Catmull was. But Ed Catmull hired him anyway. He realized that to make his dream of a computer-animated film a reality, he would need to attract the smartest people. And to attract the smartest people, he would need to overcome his own insecurities. So after hiring Smith, Catmull resolved to make a point of hiring people who were smarter than he was.
Wow, I've never thought about that before. I mean, how often do you hire people who are smarter than you?
Yeah, I think it definitely takes a lot of courage on Ed Catmull's part, but his overriding goal is this vision of creating a computer-animated film, and this technology is so primitive that he realizes he's not going to be able to do it by himself, and he needs every advantage he can get, which means having the smartest people he can find. And Catmull's focus on getting the smartest people also influenced how his team shared their research. Many of his competitors viewed the challenge to make the first computer-animated film as a race, and they closely guarded their research and trade secrets. But Catmull actually did the opposite. He published every discovery his team made and prioritized intellectual openness. He shared the team's latest work at SIGGRAPH, the annual industry conference for computer graphics. And so Catmull's lab developed a reputation for openness and industry leadership, which again enabled him to recruit the very best people in the industry. And for me, Catmull's focus on getting the right people highlights another one of our answers to the question of how you accomplish a creative project. And that's to focus on people over ideas. And Catmull would later go on to develop this idea in his book on creative management called Creativity, Inc. And his main point, Stephen, is that ideas come from people, so getting the team right is the necessary precursor to getting the ideas right. People are more important than ideas. And Catmull realized that to achieve the breakthroughs necessary for a computer-animated film, he would need to start by getting the right people. And this meant hiring people who were smarter than him and developing a culture of intellectual openness.
I think, as we've seen before, Will, a cornerstone of executing a great project is putting the right people in the right places. So I think he's absolutely on the right path here.
From the beginning, Catmull inspired his team with this dream of one day creating a computer-animated feature-length film. And this talent he gathered at New York Tech would go on to form the core of the technical team that would become Pixar. And this core group of technical talent that Catmull brought together at New York Tech developed several new tools for animation, but they were missing the necessary animation and story talent for a feature-length film. Catmull would say, "We had animators and artists, but we didn't have director-level creativity there. I could see that. I knew that we were missing something, but I didn't know how to get it." And so he has this goal to eventually create a computer-animated film, but so far he's only focused on the technology side of filmmaking. And despite his successful lab and the patronage of Alexander Schur, Catmull knows that he has to confront this fact that he's in the wrong place to make movies. But on the opposite coast, in Hollywood, a renegade filmmaker also shared Catmull's dream of using technology to make better movies. In 1977, director George Lucas released Star Wars. The film was a box office success and would forever change Hollywood's relationship with technology. And Star Wars' success was in part due to Lucas's pioneering visual effects. He knew that his space epic would require effects that had never been done before, and so he actually created his own visual effects division called Industrial Light and Magic, or ILM. And to this day, ILM is now a legendary special effects shop in Hollywood. And this creation of ILM made Lucas one of the only directors in Hollywood at the time to seriously invest in the technology of filmmaking, because the big studios at the time were too risk-averse. Lucas even based his new studio, Lucasfilm, near San Francisco, closer to tech companies of Silicon Valley, rather than with the rest of the film industry in Hollywood.
This sounds very similar to kind of the technological innovations that James Cameron is driving today.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what a lot of people forget today is that one of the key reasons Star Wars was so popular was because when it first came out, it was unlike anything people had seen before. The technology Lucas used to achieve some of the visual effects really made Star Wars stand out and was extremely innovative for the time. And with this eye towards technology, Lucas decided to set up a computer division within Lucasfilm to explore how computers could be used to make better movies. And of course, today we think of computers as synonymous with technology, but remember, this is the 70s, and most of the advances George Lucas used on the first Star Wars movie actually didn't use computers. But he's interested in this idea of how computers could be used to make even better films. And to lead this new computer division, Lucas wanted someone who knew computers, but also loved movies and believed that computers could be used to create better movies. And actually, Ed Catmull and his team at New York Tech had seen Star Wars for the first time while they were in New York City, and everyone was so amazed by the visual effects that they saw it again the same day. So with his passion for film and computers, and as the leader of one of the most important computer graphics labs, Catmull was on Lucas's short list to lead this new division. But there were also several other qualified candidates. So during interviews, Lucas asked candidates to list who else he should be talking to for the position. As you can imagine, most other candidates were unwilling to refer Lucas to their competitors. But Ed Catmull did so without hesitation. He had already overcome this insecurity when he made the decision at New York Tech to hire people who were smarter than himself. And so he listed everyone else that Lucas was interviewing.
I love that. Yeah, I mean, when selecting a leader for a project, you want them to make the best possible decisions for the project and not be self-interested. And so this kind of interview question from Lucas, which effectively is a question to demonstrate honesty, I think is a great technique of getting the right leader for your project.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, all these candidates are very technically qualified, but it's Catmull's honesty that stands out to Lucas, and so he selects him for the job to lead the Lucasfilm computer division. For Ed Catmull, this will mean leaving his comfortable position at New York Tech, but he knows this is the necessary next step in realizing his dream. He needs to be somewhere that has movie-making expertise. Ed Catmull accepted Lucas's offer and moved to the San Francisco Bay Area, where he began to assemble a new team of computer experts at Lucasfilm. He arranged for several of his colleagues from New York Tech to join, including Alvy Ray Smith, and also hired talent from the nearby Silicon Valley. And at Lucasfilm, Catmull and his newly assembled team focused on 3 digital tools Lucas believed could improve the movie-making process. Those were digital film editing, digital audio mixing and editing, and laser film printing. So at Lucasfilm, Catmull and his team are not going to be making movies. They're more like a research division, and they're going to try to build these 3 digital film tools that Lucas can use on his other movies.
So he's not quite there with his dream.
Yeah, so you notice what I didn't include on this list was making a computer animated film. Lucas doesn't really share this dream with Catmull, but Catmull is one step closer, and he does everything he can to improve the tools that he'll need to eventually make a movie one day. And for the first time at Lucasfilm, Catmull starts to think about what it would take to actually create a computer animated film. So, Stephen, computer-generated images are made of millions of these small triangles, or polygons, and Catmull estimated that to achieve the level of detail needed to produce a feature film, he would need to generate images containing up to 80 million polygons. And to do this, he calculated that at the time, it would require 100 Cray supercomputers, each costing $10 million apiece, and 2 years just to render a film that long. At that time, the software itself couldn't even handle images with more than 500,000 polygons, so 80 million is an absurd number. The hardware and the software don't exist to even try something like this. But setting the bar at 80 million did help Catmull grasp the scale of the problem he was working with, and made him realize that this goal would call for patience and a long-term approach. So he resolved to keep building the necessary tools for an eventual computer-animated movie, and to bet on computer performance improving year over year to the point where it would be affordable enough to produce a full-length movie.
Yeah, I mean, based on what you're saying here, 100 Cray computers, $10 million each, 2 years of runtime. I mean, we're talking about $1 billion just for the hardware to make the film, let alone all the other production costs. So at this point in time, yeah, I can see why it's totally out of reach.
Yeah, but what's interesting to me about Catmull is he's so focused on this vision that he doesn't give up. He thinks about what can I do right now to make steps towards that vision. And then he also realizes that he can make a bet on basically Moore's law, that the price performance of compute will improve year over year. And so he realizes that while it's not feasible right now to create an image with 80 million polygons, as computers continue to improve, it eventually will become feasible, and he wants to be ready to capitalize on that as soon as it's available. So Catmull's team continued to slowly improve the quality of computer images by creating these practical demos that showed what the technology can do. This first demo was a short sequence for the movie Star Trek II: Wrath of Khan. And Lucasfilm was hired to do the visual effects for this film, and Catmull's computer division created a scene called the Genesis effect. And this scene featured a rocket exploding on a barren planet, setting off this chain reaction that transforms the landscape of the planet into an oasis. So Catmull and his team delivered a scene that leveraged their latest advances in motion blur and anti-aliasing, and the scene wasn't perfect, but it was more impressive than any computer-generated video anyone had seen before. Critically, for the movie, it was supposed to be a computer-generated image, so it didn't look realistic or anything yet, but George Lucas was impressed. And the key scene that caught his eye was an uninterrupted flyover of the planet that would have been impossible for a camera constrained by the laws of physics. This hinted at the possibility of using computers to create movies that had never before been possible.
Yeah, that's a great point. I guess today we kind of take that for granted that a camera isn't constrained by the laws of physics because computer animation is commonplace. But back then, this was a novel idea. So, yeah, very interesting.
The second demo Catmull and his team created was a high-resolution still image called the Road to Point Reyes. And this detailed image was made possible by a new, more powerful renderer that the team had developed. So, Stephen, a renderer is a piece of software for creating computer-generated images. It basically takes a list of thousands of instructions telling a computer what's going on in an image, what the digital models look like, how they are shaded, how they're lit, how they're positioned, and the renderer follows these instructions to generate the pixels that make up the final image. Catmull's team had created a renderer called Reyes that stood for Renders Everything You Ever Saw, and they used it to generate this image of a bend in the road on the way to Point Reyes, California, which was a seaside town near Lucasfilm. And what's crazy to me is just this single image took months to generate and built on years of their cumulative work from the entire team. But it was the first film resolution image generated by a computer. And we'll link in the show notes. You can go and look at this image. It looks good, not great. I'd say it's kind of like PlayStation 2 or Nintendo 64 level graphics, but it is the first computer image that looks realistic enough to potentially be used in a feature film. But for the next step on his path to realizing his dream of a computer animated film, Catmull decided to develop a short 1-minute film for the upcoming SIGGRAPH conference. And remember, SIGGRAPH was this industry conference for computer graphics. But Catmull realizes that this will be a much larger challenge than the Star Trek scene or a still image. A short film would need to include a story and some characters, and that meant, for the first time, character animation. But Catmull still has this lingering fear that he's not artistic enough to be an animator. So he realizes his next step will be to find a talented artist who knows the art of character animation. But the artists at Lucasfilm were still suspicious of computers and feared they would take their jobs. So Catmull needs to find an animator who is also excited about the idea of computer animation. Otherwise, his dream of a computer animated film may never be anything more than a few novel tech demos. In 1983, around the same time that Ed Catmull was working on The Road to Point Reyes, a young animator from Disney named John Lasseter had visited Lucasfilm. Lasseter had an idea for a new type of film that would use computer-generated 3D backgrounds combined with traditional hand-animated characters. And he wanted to test this new idea on a film adaptation of a novella called The Brave Little Toaster, and he needed someone to help with the 3D backgrounds.
Oh, I love The Brave Little Toaster. It's a classic.
Yeah, but we're going to go on to see that The Brave Little Toaster that we're all familiar with is much different from Lasseter's initial idea.
Oh, all right. That's interesting.
So Ed Catmull was also excited by the idea of using 3D graphics for the background of a traditionally animated movie. And Lasseter was impressed by this newly completed image, The Road to Point Reyes. But Stephen, Ed Catmull and John Lasseter are kind of an unlikely pair. One was a PhD computer scientist, and Lasseter was this artistically minded animator. Catmull was 12 years older than Lasseter, and he has this quiet and serious demeanor. But Lasseter, on the other hand, is extremely laid back. He's always casually dressed in Hawaiian t-shirts and jeans. He has this round, childlike face and keeps his office cluttered with vintage toys. And even to this day, he's kind of like a kid stuck in an adult's body. But they both had experienced that magic when they fell in love with animation for the first time. Catmull and Lasseter bonded over their shared love of Disney animation and their shared interest in the potential for a computer-animated film. They both agreed to keep in touch, but several months passed and Catmull had not heard anything from Lasseter. Then one day, they both ran into each other at a computer graphics conference on the ocean liner, the Queen Mary, which at the time was permanently anchored in Long Beach, California.
I wonder if it's still there today. That's interesting. I didn't know that that ship is permanently anchored there.
It is actually, and when I went to California on vacation a year or two ago, I visited the Queen Mary, and it's still there for anyone who wants to see.
Oh, wow.
When Catmull saw Lasseter, he realized that he was visibly depressed, and he asked how his work on The Brave Little Toaster was going, but Lasseter reluctantly shared that the film had actually been canceled, and he admitted that he didn't really have a lot going on at the moment.
Wow, so what happened to Lasseter? I mean, the last we heard from him, he was working on this Brave Little Toaster project.
Yeah, so before we answer that, it's helpful to give a little bit of background on John Lasseter. And the important thing to know about him is he is the epitome of a Disney superfan. I don't know about you, but we all probably know that one friend who never really outgrew their Disney phase. And even as an adult, they religiously watch the movies and visit the parks every year. And that's basically John Lasseter. He's obsessed with Disney. He grew up in Whittier, California, and he took to drawing at an early age. His mother was actually a school art teacher and would give him pads of paper to draw on to keep him quiet in church. And Lasseter loved cartoons more than anything else. He never missed the Saturday morning cartoons, even on into high school. And in 9th grade, Lasseter's life changed forever when he came across a book in his high school library called The Art of Animation. This was a history of the Disney animation studios. Lasseter said, "There's a handful of little moments in my life that I could look back to and say they were key to me following the path that I've ended up on. Finding that book was one of them. I read it cover to cover and it dawned on me. People make cartoons for a living. They actually get paid to make cartoons." Right then, right there, I knew that was what I wanted to do. So after reading the book cover to cover, Lasseter convinced his mom to take him to see Disney's most recent animated film, The Sword in the Stone. By the time his mom picked him up from the theater, he had made up his mind. His goal in life would be to become an animator for Walt Disney Studios.
Wow, so I think I'm noticing a common theme here, Will, that it seems like a lot of leaders kind of know what they want to do at a young age.
Exactly, and similar to Ed Catmull, already here at the end of high school, Lasseter knows what he wants to be in life. So after he graduated, Lasseter was accepted to the inaugural class of a new character animation program at CalArts, which was the art school founded by Walt Disney. At CalArts, Lasseter felt right at home with his fellow Disney superfans. The program was taught by some of the legends of Disney animation, and the students there were also just as passionate about animation as the teachers. Stephen, actually, many of the students from this first class would go on to do significant work in animation. John Musker would go on to direct Aladdin, Hercules, and The Little Mermaid. Brad Bird would direct The Iron Giant and The Incredibles, and Tim Burton would direct Nightmare Before Christmas. So similar to Ed Catmull, there's this all-star cast of people who are really going to influence this industry that John Lasseter meets when he first goes to CalArts. And an interesting piece of trivia, Stephen, the courses for this program were mostly taught in classroom A113. And graduates from this program included the code A113 in many Disney and Pixar films as a reference to the classroom where they got their start in animation. A113 appeared on the license plate of the family's minivan in Toy Story, and since then, every Pixar movie has included this code hidden somewhere, and spotting it has kind of become a fan tradition.
Oh, that's interesting. I'll definitely have to start looking for that when I watch more Pixar movies.
During his junior year at CalArts, Lasseter produced a short animated film called Lady and the Lamp. And it's a short film about a lamp that gets drunk and wrecks a lamp shop. And his film actually won a Student Academy Award and was the first project to showcase what would become Lasseter's signature talent, the ability to bring inanimate objects to life. And Lasseter graduated in 1979 and landed the job he'd had always dreamed of, becoming an animator for Walt Disney Studios. However, Lasseter arrived at Disney during a troubling time. Actually, Stephen, the week before he started, half of the animation department had quit to form an independent studio. And in retrospect, this was a sign of problems to come. But when he first joined, Lasseter was excited to finally have his dream job and the opportunity to work for the company he had admired his entire life. He got his first animation experience working on The Fox and the Hound, a traditionally animated film in the classic Disney style.
Yeah, I never saw that one.
No, not a favorite there?
No.
But at Disney, Lasseter quickly became bored of recreating the same type of films that Disney had been making for many years now, and he yearned to try something new and original. And Lasseter was inspired, just like Ed Catmull, in 1977 when he saw Star Wars for the first time. It changed his entire idea of what a movie could be. He was amazed by the incredible visual effects made possible by Lucas's breakthroughs in filmmaking technology. And Lasseter himself felt certain that animation could also entertain audiences in the same way. He dedicated himself to finding a way to bring the incredible visual effects of Star Wars to animation.
So what visual effects specifically did he find impressive about Star Wars?
So you remember my comment earlier about Star Wars was like nothing anybody had ever seen before. So I think for a lot of us who grew up after Star Wars, it's easy to think that big set piece battles like the final spaceship battle in Star Wars are just common to what movies are. But if you think about movies before that time period, they focused a lot more on the drama than the visual effects. There weren't these crazy chase scenes or these big set piece space battles because just doing that wasn't possible with the technology at the time. So when Lasseter first saw, for example, the space dogfights at the end of the first Star Wars movie, he was blown away, and he wanted to try and recreate that magic using animation.
That's very interesting.
And even though he doesn't realize it at the time, seeing Star Wars for the first time gives Lasseter an appreciation for the relationship between art and technology. These dramatic visual effects that Lucas used to tell his space epic had challenged the filmmaking technology of the time. And in turn, those same visual effects now inspired Lasseter to create a new type of animation. And Lasseter would later distill this into the third idea that I think is critical for leading a creative project, and that's the idea that art challenges technology and technology inspires art.
So it's clear to me how technology inspires art here, but I'm curious, Will, can you elaborate on what it means for art to challenge technology in this example?
Yeah, so if you think about it, the entire reason George Lucas developed all these new filmmaking tools, created Lucasfilm, and stood up the computer division that Ed Catmull's a part of, is to be able to tell better stories. And so it was really Lucas's idea for a space epic and the high bar he put for that challenged new forms of technology to be able to tell these stories.
So it's almost like art has some goal, and that sort of challenges technology to enable that goal.
Exactly. And we'll continue to develop this idea as we tell the story, but it's a really interesting circular relationship where Lucas's advances with Star Wars go on to challenge Lasseter to do something new, and then Lasseter's new idea inspires new types of technology. So it's kind of this cycle. Now, at the same time that Lasseter was dreaming of making Star Wars level entertainment with animation, Disney's live-action studio was also working on something new. Their next film, Tron, was set inside a video game and would be the first movie to make significant use of computer graphics.
This is the Tron from the 80s.
Exactly, yes. And on the Disney film lot, some of Lasseter's friends from CalArts showed him the famous sequence of two computer-generated light cycles racing each other across a virtual landscape. And Lasseter was immediately blown away. He saw the potential for computer graphics to create scenes that would have been impossible for traditional 2D animation. After seeing Tron, Lasseter asked his manager for approval to test this idea. He wanted to create a 30-second test film using hand-animated characters moving around on a computer-generated 3D background. And Lasseter proposed to use characters from the book Where the Wild Things Are. But Lasseter is unsure if this idea will be approved, because he had begun to realize that Disney animation had hit a plateau. Disney's legendary animators had slowly aged out of the company, and the new generation of leadership showed little interest in sharing opportunities with young animators like Lasseter.
Okay, so it sounds like Lasseter is going to be swimming upstream to make his dream a reality at Disney.
Exactly, because he'd also been surprised to find that Disney didn't have the same collegial atmosphere that he had known at CalArts. And to be honest, his excitement for working at Disney was quickly wearing off. And this one conversation in particular was really a letdown for him. He describes it in the book To Infinity and Beyond, and he says, "This guy said to me, 'So you want to creatively be in charge here? I'll tell you how to be in charge. You sit down and do in-betweens,' which is basically the grunt work, 'for 20 years. Then you can be in charge.' In that one exchange, he killed all the enthusiasm I had to help make the project better."
And that's just a terrible way to develop leaders, right? I mean, you need creativity and new ideas to make better movies. You don't need people who just do grunt work for 20 years and earn your sort of seniority. So his whole point there just bothers me.
Yeah, and this really shows you that the culture at Disney has kind of been corrupted. This period in Disney is actually shortly after Walt Disney passed away, and so the ideals that he initially founded the company with are starting to fade away and not be true to his vision anymore. And if that wasn't enough, in addition to this stifling leadership, Lasseter also faced an uphill battle against the negative perception of computers within Disney. Walt Disney had been known for his willingness to search out and test new technologies that would ultimately help to tell a better story. And he embraced the idea that art challenges technology and technology inspires art. But after Disney's death, this idea was forgotten. The studio had made no significant advances in animation since the 60s. And by the 1970s, artists were frightened by the computer because they thought it would take their jobs. Lasseter and a few of his friends were actually the only animators who saw the potential benefits of computers. But despite these challenges, John Lasseter was obsessed with the idea of using computer graphics to create a new type of film. He presented his idea for a 3D background test using the Wild Things characters to his managers in Disney Animation. But, unsurprisingly, they refused to approve it. So, undeterred, Lasseter went over his managers' heads and got approval for the project from an executive who had worked on Tron. And here we start to see the beginnings of Lasseter's vision to use computer graphics to create better animated films. His persistence to get this project approved reinforces the idea that to lead a creative project, you must have patience and courage to stick to your vision.
And I see where the courage comes in here, him going above his manager's head.
Exactly. And to create this test footage, Lasseter began scouting for a company to perform the computer graphics work needed to create the 3D backgrounds. One of these visits was to Lucasfilm, where he met Ed Catmull for the first time. Lasseter also put together a proposal to use the 3D background idea in a feature film that would be The Brave Little Toaster.
Oh, we're talking about Brave Little Toaster again.
Yeah, so this is Lasseter's big idea. He's going to try out this test and then hopefully make a feature film. Because what Lasseter really wants is to have the creative freedom of being a director on an animated film. And so after this meeting with Lucasfilm, Lasseter finished up the test footage and presented it to the president of Walt Disney Studios, Ron Miller. Now, when the meeting started, Miller walked into the room with this grim look on his face, and Lasseter realized this is going to be a very tough sell. He screened his Wild Things test footage, showing hand-animated characters on a 3D computer-generated background, and also pitched his proposal to use the idea for Brave Little Toaster. After the pitch, Miller asked Lasseter how much it would cost, and Lasseter responded that it wouldn't be any more expensive than a traditionally animated film. But Miller replied that there was no point in using computer animation unless it could make things faster or cheaper, and he walked out of the room.
Wow, so this kind of lack of innovation has reached its way all the way to the top of Disney Studios.
Yeah, it's really sad to me to see that at this point the criteria at Disney for new ideas is if it can do things faster or cheaper. I mean, that's not inspiring at all. That's just trying to make movies into a business.
Yeah.
And Lasseter was stunned, but it was about to get even worse. In the book To Infinity and Beyond, he describes what happened next. About 5 minutes later, I got a call from Ed Hansen, which was his boss at the time. I went down to his office and he said, "Well, John, your project is now complete, so your employment with Disney Studios is now terminated." I couldn't believe it. I had just been fired.
Wait, that's insane. Why did they fire him?
So part of it is it's obvious to me that Lasseter has joined a rotten and dying organization. And I myself know that we can relate to the fact that sometimes your expectations of a person or group don't live up to reality. And that's what Lasseter's experiencing here. But for a bit of context on why Lasseter was fired, at the time, there was a political battle going on inside Disney between the existing management and the younger generation who were trying to change the company from within and bring Disney into the modern era. Remember the story about the animators who had left to start their own studio shortly before Lasseter arrived. And so really, Lasseter was just caught in the crossfire here.
It's like he was playing someone else's game.
Exactly. And I think at the time, he didn't even realize the reasons he was fired. It really just came as a shock to him. So now, he doesn't really know what to do next. Despite his courage to stick up for his vision of a computer animated film, he's been fired, and that dream seems further away than ever. Disney had been his entire life, from watching cartoons on Saturday mornings as a kid to studying at CalArts, and he's never considered working anywhere but Disney. And this brings us back to when Lasseter runs into Ed Catmull on the Queen Mary. It's only been a few weeks since he was fired from Disney, and Lasseter is still feeling numb and depressed. When Catmull asked about the Brave Little Toaster film, Lasseter had to explain that the project had been put on the shelf and he wasn't working at Disney anymore. And sensing Lasseter's embarrassment, Catmull expressed his sympathy and they parted ways. But an hour later, it clicked for Catmull. This was his chance to finally secure a talented animator to help with his dream of producing a computer animated film. So as Lasseter was sitting in the grand ballroom listening to a speaker, Catmull peeked out from behind a column and whispered that he wanted to talk. Catmull offered Lasseter a job at Lucasfilm to work on the short film he was producing for the SIGGRAPH conference. And Lasseter had just been fired. He didn't really have anything else going on, so he said, "Sure, why not?" And so began a partnership that would go on to last the next 34 years and change filmmaking forever.
Wow, that's amazing. You know, it's incredible how kind of like these legendary partnerships get their starts. You know, it always seems to be so humble.
Yeah, and completely serendipitous, just running into each other on the Queen Mary at the right time for both of them.
Yeah.
And there's a great quote from George Lucas that describes this budding partnership. He said, "The thing about Ed was he loved movies more than writing software, I think. He basically used his knowledge of technology to promote his secret love, which is making movies. And John is one of those crazy animation people, brilliant and with a great sense of humor and story, and he was in love with the idea of doing a computer animated film. It was sort of a marriage made in heaven." So now Ed Catmull finally has an animator to help him realize his dream of creating a computer animated film. And John Lasseter has found a leader who is just as obsessed with pushing the boundaries of animation as he is. It looked like Catmull and Lasseter had finally found the perfect home at Lucasfilm. But in 1983, a Hollywood divorce would suddenly put their entire future in doubt. So Ed Catmull invited John Lasseter to work at Lucasfilm in San Francisco, but he doesn't technically have permission yet to hire artists for animation work. Remember, George Lucas didn't share his same vision for a computer animated film, and Lucas is also starting to worry about the money his computer division is spending. So Catmull hired Lasseter under the unassuming title of interface designer. When he first showed up at Lucasfilm, Lasseter was immediately impressed by the quality of talent Catmull had assembled. He said, "I asked Ed, how did you get all these people? These guys are the best in the world." And he said, "Well, I try to hire people that are smarter than myself." I laughed, but that statement really hit me because Ed is really smart himself. It showed how secure he was in his own ability to let people shine. It was so opposite to what I had left behind at Disney, where all the young talent and enthusiasm was being kept down. It was amazing. I just started blossoming there.
Wow, so just clearly a better atmosphere to work and innovate in.
Exactly. And it's just a hint that the creative atmosphere is going to be so important when it comes to trying to accomplish a creative project. So Lasseter started work on a short film for the upcoming SIGGRAPH conference, and him and Catmull decided on a 1-minute film that would, for the first time, use computer animated characters to tell a story. Lasseter designed a character named Andre with this kind of cartoony, soft-looking design that used features created from geometric shapes. Lasseter also designed a bee to chase and sting Andre. And this is a simple concept, but the character interaction told a story for the first time. And when asked about his inspiration for the film's characters, Lasseter said, "I was inspired looking at the limitations of what I had to work with." His design was heavily influenced by the limitations of the computer, since it could only model geometric shapes like spheres, cylinders, and cones. So it's interesting to me because if Lasseter didn't have any limitations, he probably would have just created characters similar to the Disney animation he was familiar with. But the constraints of the technology forced him out of his comfort zone and made him try something new. And for me, Stephen, this answers one of our questions on how you lead a creative project, and this idea that art challenges technology and technology inspires art. Lasseter pushed the computer science to try new things, and in turn, he watched their solutions closely. Even when things didn't work, they sparked creative ideas he never would have imagined on his own. And this collaboration between the scientists and animators would go on to become the foundation for Pixar's approach to filmmaking.
So, Will, this feels to me like it's a revolutionary culture for a film studio.
Yeah, the idea I kind of have is that really Lasseter is using a new medium for animation. It's almost like an artist who starts using oil painting after just doing drawing. And so, of course, with this new medium, he's inspired to do things differently. So the short film Lasseter developed was called The Adventures of Andre and Wally B, and it premiered at the 1984 SIGGRAPH conference, and it was an immediate hit with the audience. At the time, the conference's tech demos were mostly just flying logos or these morphing shapes, but Lasseter's believable characters were something completely different.
So it sounds to me that the complex task they're accomplishing here is the animation of characters. Because presumably everyone else with their business logos and things like that, they're also doing 3D animation. So it's the animation of the character that's kind of pushing the bounds a little bit.
And what's really important here is that having Lasseter at Lucasfilm forces the computer scientists to develop the tools that will be necessary for computer animation. Before this, they had never had an internal customer, so to speak, to tell them what he would need to create animated characters. Now, by the time Lasseter joined Lucasfilm, Catmull's computer division had accomplished all of the original goals Lucas set. They had built new digital editing and sound tools, and these tools were gradually spun out into companies of their own as they became successful. And these new digital tools actually helped make Lucasfilm the most technologically advanced film studio of the time. But at this point, the computer division had effectively become a pure research group. They focused mainly on academic problems rather than definite products with a clear path to profitability. And this put the computer division in a precarious position when in 1983, George Lucas divorced his wife, Marcia. Under California's community property laws, the divorce required Lucas to divide his assets. And as these legal costs mounted, Lucas began cutting back, and the computer division became an obvious target. Ed Catmull knew Lucas never shared his dream of making a computer animated film, because Lucas was more interested in what computers could do to improve live-action films. So when money got tight, Catmull realized the computer division would likely be dissolved.
Wow, so he's seeing the writing on the wall, but he has this great group of talent he's working with, and they're doing awesome things. Like, how does he save this? How does he move forward?
Yeah, so he knows he has to do something, because it's really important that he keeps this group of talent together. Otherwise, his dream of a computer animated film would just die before it was even able to take off. So Catmull decided on a bold plan. What if he could spin the computer division out as its own company? He put the question to George Lucas, and Lucas agreed to sell if Catmull could find an investor to buy the new company. So now Catmull has a chance to save his dream, but he will need to find an investor who is willing to support his vision for computer animation with cold, hard cash. But Catmull's just a computer scientist. He didn't know anything about pitching investors or running a business, and so he started out, like any good academic, by going to a local bookstore and buying a book about how to start a business. So you can tell he's kind of clueless here, but it's really important for him to keep this group of talent together.
Right.
And so him and his colleague, Alvy Ray Smith, who you remember worked at Xerox PARC as an engineer, together they drew up a plan for a 40-person company. But the idea of a company that would produce computer animated films was still way too far-fetched for any investor to take seriously. So instead, Catmull and Smith based their business plan on a piece of hardware the computer division had developed called the Pixar Image Computer. The Pixar Image Computer was a specialized computer designed to scan film, add in special effects to the live-action footage, and then record the final result back onto the film. It also had some interesting applications in generating complex images for medical imaging and satellite surveillance.
Okay, so this is the first time we're hearing the word Pixar Imaging Computer. Is this where it all comes from, Will?
That's right. This is going to be the name of their company. And it's interesting, Pixar was invented by several of the computer division scientists as this Spanish-style verb that means to create pictures. So they took the word pixel and added the AR Spanish verb ending to create Pixar.
Oh, okay. Got it.
So with a business plan and a product for their new company, Ed Catmull and Alvy Ray Smith began the search for an investor to save the computer division. But they struggled to find someone who would take a risk on this emerging field of computer graphics. And Catmull was turned down by 20 different venture capitalists. Eventually, Catmull and Smith struck a deal with two major partners, the Dutch electronics giant Philips and Ross Perot's company, Electronic Data Systems. which at the time was a subsidiary of General Motors. Their plan was to use the Pixar image computer for medical imaging and automotive design.
But wait, they want to do film animation. This doesn't sound like the right way this all turns out.
That's right, but they don't have many options at this point. They've been turned down over and over, and Catmull's overriding goal is just to keep the group together. So General Motors is probably not going to produce a film anytime soon, but this is kind of their last shot. Just a week before the contracts were signed, the entire deal collapsed. Not because of Pixar, but there was this unrelated dispute between Ross Perot and General Motors.
So he's back to square one then.
Exactly. After months of exhaustive searching, their last chance has fallen through. And they're running out of time because George Lucas decided that if the computer division had not found a buyer by end of year, he would shut it down. And now, as you can imagine, Catmull's beginning to think this crazy idea of launching his own company is a mistake. But he mentions these struggles to one of his old friends from the University of Utah, Alan Kay. And since leaving Utah, Alan Kay had also worked with Alvy Ray Smith at Xerox PARC, where Kay had developed a computer called the Alto. And the key innovation for the Alto was its revolutionary windowed user interface. It could display pictures and text together on screen and included the first computer mouse. So we talked earlier about the graphical user interface. Kay was basically the inventor of this idea. Before this, all the inputs for a computer were just typed in, if you've ever seen like the green screen with the wall of text.
Right.
And while at Xerox PARC, Alan Kay had met a young Silicon Valley entrepreneur named Steve Jobs when he had famously visited in 1979. The Alto had inspired Jobs to add a graphical user interface to his Macintosh computer, and the Mac went on to kick off the personal computer revolution. Afterwards, Jobs remained friends with Alan Kay and eventually hired him as an Apple Fellow. So when Alan Kay heard Catmull was looking for an investor, he arranged to introduce them to Steve Jobs. Kay knew that Steve Jobs was also interested in the relationship between creativity and technology.
Oh, wow. So Steve Jobs is getting involved in this story.
So Ed Catmull and Alvy Ray Smith met Steve Jobs at his Silicon Valley mansion, where he lived this radically minimalist life. The entire house was empty except for a BMW motorcycle, a grand piano, and a fully stocked kitchen where two personal chefs prepared his vegetarian meals. And Jobs was immediately interested in the work Pixar was doing. He had some experience in 2D graphics from the launch of the Macintosh, but he had never seen anything like the 3D work Catmull's team was doing. Jobs also believed deeply in the promise of combining art and technology. On the Macintosh, he designed beautiful fonts and a playful, intuitive interface, these things that engineers thought were trivial, but that made computers feel human. And at Pixar, he saw the same combination: cutting-edge computer graphics and the possibility for a new type of storytelling.
So Steve Jobs sounds like the perfect investor for Catmull.
Yeah, and it's really a lucky break for Ed Catmull because it's hard to imagine a better investor than Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs has this experience with technology, but he's also really passionate about art, which is exactly what Catmull will need for his dream of making a computer animated film.
And he's got a lot of money.
Maybe not enough, though. As we will see, Pixar is going to need some very deep pockets. But despite this initial interest from Steve Jobs, negotiations proceeded slowly. At the time, Jobs was in the process of being forced out of Apple after his disagreements with the new CEO led him to stage a failed boardroom coup. So this is not really a great time for Jobs to be investing in another company. Things at Apple are starting to fall apart. A few months later, after Jobs had left Apple, he went on to start his second personal computer company, Next. But he kept his eye on the Lucasfilm computer division, and now, with George Lucas desperate for a buyer, Jobs realizes the timing is right. He called Lucas and offered to buy the computer division for $5 million plus an additional $5 million of guaranteed investment. Now, this was substantially less than Lucas's asking price of $15 million, but the timing was right and he agreed. So the computer division was spun out of Lucasfilm to create a new company called Pixar, named after its most promising product, the Pixar Image Computer.
So, Will, this story still doesn't feel like it's on the right tracks. I mean, they're going to make a computer as a company? I mean, Pixar makes movies. What ends up happening?
Yeah, so again, Catmull's on this roller coaster of having the opportunity to pursue his dream, but then it's pulled away. And so his goal here is really just to keep the talent and his dream alive by finding an investor who can support computer graphics in general. And Steve Jobs, his experience is in running computer companies, so that's primarily what he's interested in for Pixar. But before selling, George Lucas warned Jobs that Lasseter and Catmull were hell-bent on producing a computer-animated film. And Jobs was inspired by Catmull's fusion of art and technology, but initially he's more interested in the potential of Pixar as a computer company, similar to Apple or Next. Jobs said, "I truly believed that computer graphics could be used to make products that would be extremely mainstream. Not tangible manufactured products, but something more like software, intellectual products. And what I saw at Pixar was some amazing computer science and the possibility of that being used in an even more artistic fashion than I had ever been involved in. So I was very excited." And this is really interesting to me, Stephen, because Steve Jobs is kind of hinting at the idea that's going to become Pixar, the computer animated films that we're familiar with today, but he's not quite there yet. And for me, what he didn't realize at the time was that the true value of the computer division was not in the technology itself, but in the talent it had produced. People are more important than ideas.
Wow, it's really interesting that we keep coming back to this theme about talent.
Now, Ed Catmull and John Lasseter were excited to work with Jobs because they could tell that he believed in their passion and vision. But they're a little uneasy about what it would mean to have him as a business partner. Steve Jobs was notoriously temperamental and difficult to work with. For the first time, Catmull's team will now need to stand on its own as a profitable business. Computer animation is an exciting research project, but Catmull's going to have to find a way to pay the bills and earn a profit for his new investor, Steve Jobs. Now that Pixar is an independent company, Ed Catmull has to transform his research group into a successful business. And the next 5 years are going to be a period of constant searching for the right business model to make Pixar profitable. Steve Jobs' initial business plan was for Pixar to be a hardware company that focused on sales of the Pixar Image Computer. But Pixar's not Apple. Unlike the mass-market Apple personal computers, the Pixar computer was really specialized, and just one computer sold for $125,000 in 1985. So initially, Catmull and Jobs found some success selling these computers to intelligence agencies and medical specialists, but the sales were really slow, and Pixar was losing money. Ed Catmull continues to search for a business model that can be profitable. When the hardware sales slumped, he tried to pivot to software. So his team had continued to develop their Reyes renderer. Remember, this was the program that had created the Road to Point Reyes image. And they released a commercial version of this renderer and branded it as RenderMan. In addition to rendering the image, RenderMan also included a computer interface for digital artists to create scenes. So this interface would break the components of an animated scene down into these simple layers of instructions that an animator could easily control. And Catmull in his book describes it as similar to using like the gear shift and the steering wheel and pedals to drive your car without having to know the details of how the engine works. So this is basically a tool that artists can use to create digital images. But unfortunately, RenderMan was ahead of its time. In the late 80s, very few filmmakers had a need for computer graphics, and the RenderMan software was slow to take off.
So I get the sense that Steve Jobs is still kind of seeing Pixar through the lens of Apple and isn't really considering it a serious animation company yet.
That's true. And, the RenderMan software would actually go on to really take off and be a critical tool for making computer animated movies. But it was just ahead of its time. Eventually, it did become the dominant standard for digital work in Hollywood, and that's still true even to this day. RenderMan has been used to make movies like Jurassic Park, Terminator 2, Avatar, and Interstellar. But for now, sales of the Pixar computer and RenderMan software continued to lag. The one bright spot at Pixar during this time was John Lasseter's animation. For Steve Jobs, animation was still a sideline to Pixar's main business of hardware and software, but Ed Catmull was determined to keep the company's animation efforts going. He justified them as a way to show off Pixar's products and asked Lasseter to develop another short film for the 1986 SIGGRAPH conference. At the time, Lasseter had been taking computer modeling lessons and was working on a digital model of his Luxo desk lamp as sort of a character study. And a Luxo lamp, for anyone not familiar, is like a classic spring-loaded lamp with two metal arms, a pivoting shade, and then a heavy base. It's like the kind you swing around to light up your desk. And so after Lasseter finished up this 3D model, he starts playing around with it a bit on his computer and moving the lamp around as if it were alive. And as he played with the model, Lasseter was inspired to use the lamp as a character in his next short film. It would showcase his characteristic talent for making inanimate objects appear to be alive. But bringing this lamp to life would require not just movement, but lighting too. As the lamp moved around, it would need to shine light across the room and create realistic shadows. So Lasseter challenged the programmers to solve this problem, and they delivered with a breakthrough called self-shadowing. For the first time, computer-generated objects could cast believable shadows on themselves and their surroundings.
So this is kind of where Pixar's classic logo gets born.
Yeah, that's right. A coworker's younger son inspired Lasseter to add a baby lamp, and this lamp would eventually go on to become basically Pixar's mascot and their equivalent of Mickey Mouse. It always hops in to introduce the Pixar logo before each of their films, and turns out the lights after the closing credits. So Lasseter created a short film about a parent lamp and its energetic child, and the film became known as Luxo Jr. It made its debut at the 1986 SIGGRAPH conference. The film was just over 2 minutes long and featured this parent lamp watching its baby lamp play with a rubber ball as it hops and peeks around and then eventually pops the ball. And the key here is Lasseter's talent for giving personality to inanimate objects created a believable computer animated character for the first time. And even before the film had finished, the crowd at SIGGRAPH erupted into a standing ovation because no one had ever seen anything like it before.
Wow.
And after the screening, a computer programmer approached Lasseter to ask a question. And of course, Lasseter braces himself for a difficult question about the self-shadowing technology or some other technical aspect. But instead, the programmer asked, was the parent lamp a mother or a father? And at that moment, Lasseter knew that he had a breakthrough. For the first time, the characters in the film were more important than the technology.
I guess what I want to say is that it seems like the threshold is sort of being crossed where characters are now believable and people identify with the characters rather than technology, which is kind of the point.
Exactly. That's going to be the critical piece to make a feature film because, of course, films are all about characters. And so if you can't create believable characters with computer animation, you're definitely not going to be able to tell a story. So this is a really important milestone in what will eventually become Toy Story. And Luxo Jr. actually became the first 3D computer animated film to ever be nominated for an Academy Award. And to me, Stephen, this whole story of Luxo Jr. is an excellent example of our idea that art challenges technology and technology inspires art. Lasseter's work on the 3D model of his desk inspired the characters in Luxo Jr. And then his animated lamps, in turn, challenged Pixar's computer scientists to develop improved shadowing techniques. And it was this combination of Lasseter as the animator and the technical team working together that led to the success of Luxo Jr.
Like, it's just amazing to me how you see the opening credits with Pixar, right? You see Luxo Jr., and there's so much depth to what's happening there, right? There's this intertwining of art and science. But that intertwining of art and science has been so successful that it just kind of bleeds away, and you're just appreciating the character that's in there. And that's the whole point.
Yeah, that's completely true. And I think it's this interesting paradox where if Lasseter and Catmull are doing a good job, you almost can't tell because the goal is to make the characters so realistic that they just fade away and it seems natural. But to do that, it takes a lot of work to make it look easy. And Luxo Jr. was followed by 3 more short films, 1 per year, including Red's Dream, Tin Toy, and Knick Knack. And Tin Toy actually won the Academy Award for Best Animated Short Film, making it the first computer animated film to win an Oscar.
Oh, no kidding.
So Lasseter's short films are bringing a lot of prestige to Pixar, but they didn't really help sell any hardware. So far, Pixar had only sold 120 computers. Steve Jobs continued to encourage Ed Catmull to find a mass market use for the Pixar computer, but it never really made the leap from a few early adopters to the mainstream. And when sales failed to materialize, Ed Catmull witnessed Steve Jobs' difficult personality firsthand. To reduce losses, Jobs laid off 1/3 of Pixar employees without severance. And Catmull's co-founder, Alvy Ray Smith, also left the company around this time after he got into a heated argument with Steve Jobs over circuit board delays. And during these struggles to find a profitable business model for Pixar, Catmull himself became increasingly burnt out, and he even considered resigning.
Wow, I mean, this is Ed Catmull's dream. I mean, if he's considering resigning, things must be getting really bad.
Yeah, this is definitely a dark time for Pixar. And Steve Jobs himself even became frustrated because he was forced to spend a significant part of his personal fortune just to keep Pixar alive. Between 1986 and 1991, he personally invested another $55 million in Pixar, more than half of his payout from when he left Apple.
That's a huge amount of his net worth, but it also kind of says that Steve Jobs truly sees something in Pixar if he's putting that much in.
Yeah, I think Steve Jobs continued to have faith in Catmull and Lasseter's passion and vision, but that's not to say that his faith wasn't tested a few times. Actually, he considered selling Pixar 3 separate times during this period, but he could never really bring himself to do it. At this time, he had been kicked out of Apple, and his new company Next wasn't really doing that well either, so he couldn't afford for Pixar to be seen as another failure.
I mean, my thoughts are, what a tough time to be everyone in that situation. I mean, Steve Jobs is looking at potentially a 3rd failure. He's putting half his net worth in this company. And then for Catmull, I mean, he has 1/3 of his staff laid off, and he's still trying to just fight for his dream, but also make this profitable company. So a lot's got to change very quickly for Catmull to realize his dream.
But there is one option left: John Lasseter and his computer animated films. With Pixar's finances deep in the red and Steve Jobs threatening to sell the company, Ed Catmull realizes he has nothing to lose. In 1990, he resolved to take a gamble on his original passion, computer animation. And he said, as the losses mounted, it became clear there was only one path forward. We needed to abandon selling hardware. We decided to go all in on what we'd yearned to do from the outset, computer animation. This was where our true passion resided, and the only option left was to go after it with everything we had. Catmull's first step to pivot the company towards computer animation was to start making commercials. He said, "Commercials are like little short stories, and by doing them, we would subject ourselves to real-world deadlines and pressures that you'd have to deal with if you were going to make movies. Restrictions are part of art, and we had to bring that into our process." And Stephen, I really like this last part where he says restrictions are part of art, because I think sometimes we have this mistaken idea that creativity is just comes out of nothing from a blank slate. But I think the point Catmull puts here is that to actually create art that people can enjoy, you need to embrace the restrictions on it. And so commercials might not be very exciting to do for these artists, but it's a great way to put some real world constraints on their animation while also making money for the company and developing this animation muscle that they're going to need to build if they eventually want to make a feature-length movie.
Yeah, I think that doing commercials is kind of the perfect first baby step for them on their sort of journey to do feature-length films.
Yeah, and I think it's important to mention this step here because it's going to be an important milestone on the way to ultimately creating Toy Story. And I know I personally didn't know that Pixar made commercials originally, but it reminds me of that quote I shared at the top of the episode from Steve Jobs that if you look closely, most overnight successes actually took a long time. And so I think most people see Toy Story and think of, oh, it's just their first film and, they probably worked on it for 4 years and it was a breakout success. But really, it's 25 years in the making and commercials are just another step on that journey. The first commercial Pixar made was for Tropicana orange juice, and it featured a straw searching for an orange. The commercial was a great success, and for the first time, Catmull and Lasseter started earning some money for doing what they loved. Pixar also created commercials for Trident Gum, Listerine, and Lifesavers, and they all featured Lasseter's unique style of inanimate objects as lifelike characters. And Stephen, the Lifesavers commercial actually won a Clio, which is the Oscar equivalent in the advertising world.
Oh, okay. So it sounds like their commercials must be really successful.
Yeah, the commercials are doing well. And to support their work, Lasseter hired several more animators and began to grow the production staff that eventually would be needed for the feature-length movie. And critically, John Lasseter followed Catmull's example of hiring people who were smarter than he was. You can imagine, as the only animator at Pixar at the time, he could have easily hired lesser talents to ensure that his job wasn't threatened, but instead he sought out the very best people he could find.
So it sounds like all of these pieces are slowly starting to come together for the feature-length film.
Exactly. And I think the most important piece here, to our point earlier, is the people. And so this is another example to me of focusing on people over ideas. Of course, Pixar didn't need world-class animators just to create commercials, but Lasseter knew that building a team of the best animators would be critical for work on something more complex, like a feature film.
I love the long-term thinking here, just like sowing the seeds of future success on this movie. They're so concentrated on making this dream a reality, and it's just awesome to see them slowly put all the pieces together like this.
Now, with the success of the commercials and the growing animation department, Catmull could finally move on from the Pixar image computer. In 1991, he got an offer to sell the hardware division of Pixar, and he immediately accepted. So Pixar was now purely focused on computer animation. But the Pixar computer was not a total loss. One of its few successes had been a contract with Disney to develop a new animation software known as CAPS. And CAPS stands for Computer Animated Production System. This was basically a system that ran on a bank of Pixar image computers, and it was used to automate the time-intensive process of inking and painting for traditional animation. And in the past, Disney's management had no interest in partnering with outside studios on any film, much less a computer-animated one. But with CAPS, Pixar was able to get their foot in the door in hopes of eventually partnering on a feature film. And inside Disney, things were starting to change. Walt Disney's nephew, Roy Disney, had ultimately reached the same conclusion as Lasseter, that Disney had lost the ability to innovate and had become stagnant. So in 1984, he led a shareholder revolt and brought in new management, including CEO Michael Eisner.
Oh, wow. Okay, so what does Eisner start doing?
So Eisner, along with Roy Disney, completely revitalized Disney animation and ushered in what became known as the Disney Renaissance of the 90s, with successful films like The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, and The Lion King. And with this string of successes, Disney was now looking for opportunities to expand their film production and meet the public's demand for more Disney films.
Yeah, those are all classics. They've clearly started to turn things around.
Yeah, this has become a very different Disney from the one that Lasseter was fired from. And as part of this restructuring, Michael Eisner brought in Jeffrey Katzenberg to lead Disney Animation Studios. And Katzenberg was on the hunt for new directors to create Disney's next animated films. Katzenberg had closely followed John Lasseter's successful SIGGRAPH films, and he particularly liked the short film Tin Toy. Tin Toy had told the story of a wind-up toy called Tinny, who runs from a baby as he tries to put it in his mouth. And Katzenberg really thought the idea of toys that come to life had great promise, and he actually started to court Lasseter in hopes of bringing him back to Disney to direct a film.
Oh, that had always been Lasseter's dream, to direct a film at Disney.
Yeah, this could be a huge problem for Pixar because John Lasseter is the bedrock of their fledgling animation studio, and now he's offered this great opportunity to become a director at Disney like he had always wanted. So you have to imagine this is very tempting for Lasseter.
Very tempting. So what does he end up doing?
Well, Lasseter seriously considered the offer, but by now he had completely bought into Catmull's dream of producing a computer-animated film, and he felt that Pixar was the only place where he could make that a reality. So Lasseter told Catmull, "I can go to Disney and be a director, or I can stay here and make history." Lasseter told Disney that if they wanted to do something with him, they should partner with Pixar.
So I'm sensing the tide is starting to turn in Catmull and Lasseter's favor.
So in early 1991, Katzenberg invited Catmull, Lasseter, and Steve Jobs to meet at Disney's Burbank offices in LA and discuss partnering on a film. Lasseter pitched the idea of a 30-minute Christmas special where Tinny the wind-up toy gets separated from his owners and teams up with a ventriloquist doll to make his way home. And Katzenberg loved the idea of telling a story from a toy's perspective and insisted that instead of a 30-minute special, it should be a feature-length film.
This is a huge moment, so they're finally getting their big chance.
Yeah, and it's in large part due to John Lasseter. Jeffrey Katzenberg really wants his talent as a director, but since he won't leave Pixar, Katzenberg decides he'll partner with them. But it's interesting to me, Stephen, that he's more interested in working with Lasseter than a computer-animated film.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, a computer-animated film is secondary to Katzenberg, but I think it's because he also understands this idea that people are more important than ideas. He could have easily found someone else to direct a story about toys that come to life, but he understood that the people who execute this idea were more important than the idea itself.
So, Will, what does this partnership between Disney and Pixar actually look like?
Yeah, so it's interesting. There's this months-long negotiation process between Steve Jobs and Jeffrey Katzenberg on exactly what the details of this relationship are going to look like. And this is where it's really beneficial for Catmull and Lasseter to have the business expertise of Steve Jobs, because he's a great negotiator and he can go toe-to-toe with Katzenberg. It's interesting because Katzenberg's personality was kind of similar to Steve Jobs. He could be charming when it suited his goal, like getting Lasseter to join. But once negotiations started, his aggressive side came out. And Katzenberg actually told the Pixar team, "Everybody thinks I'm a tyrant. I am a tyrant, but I'm usually right." So this negotiation process is interesting to me because Pixar has the technical know-how and, importantly, the director talent with John Lasseter, but otherwise they don't have any of the infrastructure needed to make a movie. So there's three things that Pixar needs from Disney. They need Disney's decades of filmmaking expertise and experience. because Pixar's never made a movie before. They also need someone to finance production of the film. It's going to cost about $30 million to produce an animated film. And remember, Pixar is still deep in the red at this point, and Steve Jobs doesn't have enough money to finance an entire film. And most importantly, Pixar needs Disney's distribution network for advertising and getting this film into theaters. So really, you can see here that Pixar needs Disney much more than Disney needs Pixar, and the terms of the deal are going to reflect this. The contract stipulated that Disney would have complete creative control and would own the final films and characters outright. Pixar would receive only 12.5% of ticket revenues. Disney also got the option on Pixar's next two films and the right to make sequels with or without Pixar. And finally, Disney reserved the right to terminate the film at any time with only a small penalty.
Those are some steep terms, but I guess if Disney is financing the whole thing, what does Pixar have to lose?
Yeah, it's an unbalanced negotiation here, but Pixar is going to get a lot from Disney, and most importantly, their first chance to finally pursue the feature-length animated film they've wanted to make for so long.
Yeah, this is finally their shot.
So after several months of intense negotiation, Jobs and Katzenberg signed a contract to make 3 computer-animated movies. Pixar would produce the films, and Disney would fund and distribute them. Stephen, this is a huge inflection point for Pixar here. Ed Catmull has been chasing this dream for almost 20 years, and now he finally has everything in place. But what's interesting to me here, Stephen, is Catmull himself doesn't have the animation and filmmaking talent. So now he must trust in the people he has assembled to deliver the ideas needed to make a great movie. With everything in place, the task now falls to John Lasseter to make it a reality. But Lasseter and his small team of animators have never made anything longer than a 30-second TV commercial or a 5-minute short film. Creating an 80-minute feature film will be much more challenging. And their partnership with Disney may do more harm than good. As Lasseter and everyone at Pixar prepares for the daunting task of making their first film, quality is top of mind. Everyone shared a desire to set the bar high for story and image quality. And this is really important, Stephen, because in the early 80s, a lot of companies had overpromised and underdelivered on the quality of computer graphics, and this had led people in Hollywood to think that computer graphics was not a serious art form. So it was really important for this very first computer animated film that they set the quality bar really high.
Yeah, I mean, they absolutely have to knock it out of the park here.
But Lasseter himself doesn't have any experience as a director. You've got to imagine he's feeling a lot of pressure here. Not only is this his first film as a director, but he's doing it with a team that has never made a movie before. And just a few months ago, they were selling computer hardware. And before Lasseter can start production on this film, there's 3 things he's got to do first. He needs to build a team of animators and artists. He needs to write the story for the film and hire actors to voice the characters. So his first step is to assemble a core animation and story team of 4 people. Himself, Andrew Stanton and Pete Docter, who had been hired previously to direct commercials, and Lasseter's friend Joe Ranft, who had previously worked as a storyboard artist at Disney. And Andrew Stanton and Pete Docter would go on to be some of Pixar's most successful directors, directing films like Finding Nemo and Monsters, Inc. And as this team began working together, they discovered an amazing creative chemistry. They began to finish each other's sentences, they raced scooters around the office and played laser tag late at night when everyone else had gone home for the day, and it was really like finding the right members for a band. Now, no one in the group had ever written a movie before, but they actually leveraged this as an asset. They didn't let the way things had always been done before hold them back. And importantly, this wasn't about trying to reinvent the wheel, but it was more about not being complacent and tackling this movie from a first principles approach.
Yeah, if anything, it feels like this is to their advantage.
Stephen, what's important to me about this is that Lasseter developed a core team that works well together before starting work on the story. And this ties back into our idea that you should focus on people over ideas. Ed Catmull has a great quote on this where he says, "If you give a good idea to a mediocre team, they will screw it up. If you give a mediocre idea to a brilliant team, they will either fix it or throw it away and come up with something better." Right now, the idea for Toy Story is really just a mediocre idea. It's about this tin toy and a ventriloquist doll. But in the hands of the right team, it's going to transform into the story we know today. So with this core team in place, Lasseter began work on writing the story. At the time, every animated movie was either a fairy tale or a musical, but Lasseter wanted to do something new and original. He wanted to prove that this new art form of computer animation could entertain adults and kids. The original pitch for Toy Story was this: everyone has had the traumatic childhood experience of losing a toy. Our story takes the toy's point of view as he loses and tries to regain the single thing most important to him, to be played with by children. This is the reason for the existence of all toys. It is the emotional foundation of their existence. And early computer graphics tended to make things look kind of plasticky, so Lasseter thought a story about plastic toys was a great idea.
Okay, yeah, I see how they're getting to the idea of Toy Story, but they still have a long way to go.
Yeah, and as this core group of animators started writing the script, the idea of a toy being driven by a desire to find its owner felt right, but the story itself was kind of convoluted. So Lasseter and Andrew Stanton came up with a new idea. What if the story was a buddy picture, focusing on the relationship between two toys, an old toy that was a child's favorite, and a new toy that threatened to steal his place?
Woody and Buzz.
Exactly. So once they hit on this new idea, the story really started to come together, and the team moved on to the characters. And there's this funny scene that you can just picture in your mind, Stephen. Lasseter borrowed the Pixar company credit card, and he took the whole team on a field trip to Toys R Us. And basically they bought a bunch of toys for inspiration for the characters for Toy Story.
To me, that's a great idea because, if you're an adult, you're trying to animate a film, you kind of got to touch grass a little bit and kind of see what kids are playing with these days. So I love it.
The group decided that Tinny, the tin toy, was miscast, and they needed a new toy. So Lasseter combined his son's love of action figures with his childhood interest in NASA to create a spaceman doll. They named him Buzz Lightyear after the famous Apollo 11 astronaut Buzz Aldrin.
Oh, so that's how Buzz gets his name.
Yeah, and with this new Buzz Lightyear character, the wooden ventriloquist doll named Woody kind of felt out of place. And the Disney executives were also worried that ventriloquist dummies had become a staple of horror movies, so not a good idea to put that in a kids' movie. And Woody became a cowboy pull-string doll instead. And this makes a lot of sense because the idea of a buddy film is to have two characters who are as different from each other as possible. And this cowboy and spaceman represented two different eras of cool toys. But they also had this underlying through line that they're both classic American heroes exploring the frontier. With the two main characters decided on, the final piece of the puzzle before production could start was hiring actors. And this will be a new challenge for Lasseter because none of his short films so far had included characters who talked. But Disney was able to help. At the top of Lasseter's list for the voice of Woody was actor Tom Hanks. So Disney facilitated the introduction, and Lasseter pitched Hanks with a short computer-animated test of Woody. And I think Tom Hanks' reaction to this test screen is really interesting and shows us the public's perception of computer-animated films at the time. He said, "It was startling, actually, kind of hypnotic. It was like, can I see that again? I think I must have watched it 3 or 4 times. It didn't look like animation. It looked like plasticine come to life. After that, they showed me the standard storyboards, but I couldn't explain what it was like to see that animation. I just felt that they were reinventing or inventing something, that this was going to be a whole new thing." So Tom Hanks agreed to join the cast and voice Woody. And for the other main character, Buzz Lightyear, Lasseter chose stand-up comedian and TV actor Tim Allen. And what's interesting to me, Stephen, here is Lasseter and his team initially thought of Buzz as a superhero toy who was kind of full of himself and overconfident. But Tim Allen voiced Buzz to sound like a regular, everyday guy. And so Buzz's character evolved into a regular guy who was trying to save the world. And Buzz became a much better character because of Allen's contribution in the recording session. And to capture this idea, there's a quote that I just love from Pete Docter, where he says, "A good director allows a film to be something that changes and grows and adapts to the strengths of people, the strengths of technology, all the things you have available." And Stephen, for me, this pulls together two of our ideas. One, focus on people over ideas, that you should be able to adapt your ideas based on inputs from other people. And then also the idea that technology inspires art. So Pete Docter's idea is that a great director is able to pull together new ideas from the people he's working with, from technology, to create the best film possible.
Yeah, it's really interesting how a lot of these ideas that we've been talking about are coming together.
Now, with the team, story, and lead actors in place, Lasseter and his team of animators are ready to begin work on storyboards. And storyboards are basically like these comic book panels. They're used to draft each scene before committing to fully animating it. But the executives at Disney were concerned Pixar might not be up to the task of jumping from short films to a full-length movie. And they insisted on regular reviews of the storyboards.
So Disney is starting to meddle a little bit.
They are, but actually it's initially welcomed by Lasseter, because as the animators started to dive into the complexities of creating each scene, Lasseter found himself starting to defer to Disney's expertise rather than trusting his own vision for the film. And you can't really blame him, because this is his first film as a director, and part of what Pixar was getting from Disney in this contract was some of their filmmaking expertise. But it's going to be a fine balance, because you could shift too far to where you're making Disney's movie and not your own. Over the course of a year, Lasseter and his animators fell into a cycle. They would storyboard scenes for the film, deliver them to Disney for review, and then incorporate Disney's feedback to create new storyboards. And as work progressed, Jeffrey Katzenberg at Disney became concerned that the film about toys may come across as a movie just for kids. He believed it needed to lean into a more adult direction. And one of the Disney executives overseeing the film said, Jeffrey would always be pushing for what he called edge, which was code for snappy, adult, on the edge of inappropriate, and not too young. A series of notes were given, over a number of drafts and storyboard pitches, that the film was too juvenile, and that the film didn't have enough edge. And Katzenberg even forbid Pixar from using the word toy in the title.
So they're forbidden from using the word toy and what would eventually be Toy Story, so I wonder what ends up happening.
Yeah, we can already see that they're not headed down the right path here for the Toy Story movie as we know it. But, John Lasseter was aware of his limited experience and bargaining power with Disney, so he reluctantly agreed to Katzenberg's edits. And after a year of this storyboarding and feedback, Lasseter and his team traveled down to Disney to screen the test reels for the first half of the movie. And a reel is basically a rough draft of the film. It's these hand sketches with sample dialogue. They haven't started the animation yet. But everyone at Pixar had been working furiously to get the reels done on time. And no one had really taken a step back to look at their work as a whole. And this fateful screening at Disney would go on to be known within Pixar as Black Friday.
Uh-oh. What happened?
Well, so as Lasseter's watching these reels in front of the Disney executive, he realizes how far the film had strayed from his initial vision. Lasseter's plan had been to start Woody off as a selfish toy, and then make him into a likable guy by the end of the movie. But as the story went through round after round of Katzenberg's notes, Woody turned into this edgy, tyrannical jerk who treated the other toys poorly and was completely unlikable. At one point in the reels, Woody pushes Buzz out of a window and says, "It's a toy-eat-toy world."
Oh my God, that's terrible.
Yeah, and in another scene, Woody orders the Slinky dog to help him push the other toys off the bed. And when Slinky hesitates, Woody yells, "Who said your job was to think, spring wiener?"
Oh man.
So he's just a total jerk in this movie and completely unlikable.
Yeah.
But as Lasseter's watching his characters on these reels, he can't believe what his story has become. And he said, "I tell you, I sat there and I was pretty much embarrassed with what was on the screen. I had made it. I had directed everybody to do this. But it was a story filled with the most unhappy, mean characters that I've ever seen." And Stephen, years later, Pixar actually released this Black Friday reel. I'll link to it in the show notes, but it's really bad. It's really bad. You should go watch it.
I kind of want to.
And after this awful screening, Disney ordered Pixar to shut down production immediately. Pixar was instructed to lay off a large portion of the crew and move the story team down to LA, where they would rewrite the story under Disney's supervision.
Wow, that's insane.
Yeah, so this Black Friday reel is so bad that Disney basically feels that they need to go nuclear here and just completely bring the project in-house. Because remember, this was one of the first few films that Disney did with an outside studio, so they're very nervous about having an outside studio produce something that's going to have the Disney branding on it. And so when they see these mean characters, they're like, we are not putting Disney's brand on this. But John Lasseter begged Katzenberg to give them 2 weeks to turn things around. He knew cutting staff and moving production to LA would only have ensured that Toy Story was a failure. And Katzenberg reluctantly agreed to the delay, just because enforcing the layoffs immediately would mean firing employees just before the holidays. So Ed Catmull shifted crew to the commercials division, while Lasseter and his lead animators locked themselves in a room to rework the story. And actually, Steve Jobs even had to fund production of Toy Story with money out of his own pocket while production was halted. So now, Catmull and Lasseter's dream and Pixar's future is at risk. If Lasseter can't turn the story around, the first computer animated film could fail before it even reaches the screen. And if that happens, Pixar likely won't get another chance. 20 years of work toward a single goal now hinges on this moment.
Wow. So we've gone from them finally being able to pursue their dream to now they're on the edge of getting shut down. So how did we get here?
Yeah, obviously something is deeply wrong with inside Pixar. And actually, after the Black Friday screening, Katzenberg asked a Disney executive, "Why is this so terrible?" This executive, Tom Schumacher, later spelled out the root cause of the problem. He said, they were following Jeffrey Katzenberg's notes, and the project had been driven completely off track by trying to seek a voice that fundamentally wasn't the voice of Pixar or the voice of John Lasseter. Stephen, I think this quote from Tom Schumacher really hits at the source of the problem and is a great example of our idea that you must have the patience and courage to stick to your vision.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he didn't push back at all. And as you said earlier, they were in this cycle where they basically just kept taking Disney's notes and trying to incorporate that. So, Will, how would you characterize Katzenberg's headspace at this time? I mean, the Disney executive is telling him what's wrong. Is he starting to understand that?
Yeah, I think he realized it's a wake-up call. Remember, in Katzenberg's position, he's the head of the studio, so he doesn't want to produce a movie that's just for kids, because that really narrows your audience. So it's understandable that he has these notes to give it some more edge and make it not just a kids' movie. But he has to balance that with deferring to the creative vision of John Lasseter, the director who he's picked for this project.
So it's a wake-up call.
Yeah, it's a wake-up call, and to his credit, Katzenberg gives John Lasseter a chance to try to redo this. And it's really interesting to me to think about what's going on in John Lasseter's mind right now, too. Just like Ed Catmull had to find the courage to go all in on this dream of computer animation to save Pixar, Lasseter has to find the courage to stick to his vision for Toy Story. Prior to this moment, I think Lasseter had a bit of imposter syndrome, having never directed a film before. This made him defer to Disney and Katzenberg's notes rather than having the courage to stick to his own ideas. And so really, Lasseter's been trying to make a movie that's not his, and it's not working. But the failure of the Black Friday screening is the wake-up call Lasseter needed to give him the confidence to trust in his vision for the film. With the future of Pixar on the line, Lasseter gathered his animators and said, "Let's just make the movie we want to make." They resolved to listen to Disney's notes, but only to implement the ones they felt made the movie better. And I think Lasseter did a great job of summing up this new approach when he said, "It was the most selfish movie making ever."
Okay, so they're finally going all in on their idea.
Yes. Over the next few weeks, Lasseter and his animators spent almost every waking moment together rewriting the story. They completely reworked Woody's character. He would be a well-intentioned but selfish toy who didn't realize his selfishness until it was too late. The scene where Woody pushed Buzz out the window was rewritten to Woody accidentally knocking him out the window. And much of Woody's dialogue was also changed to make him more sympathetic. 3 months later, Lasseter and his team had completely remade the first 1/3 of the film, and Pixar screened the new reels for Katzenberg. It wasn't great yet, but it was finally headed in the right direction, and Katzenberg put the film back into production. There would be no layoffs or relocation to LA.
So to Katzenberg's credit, he gave them a chance to turn it around, and they did it.
They did. Lasseter said, "It was so refreshing because we were finally making the movie we wanted to make, with the kind of humor, emotion, and action that we liked." And I tell you, from that point on, everything started working. So with the story mostly corrected, Toy Story entered into full production. The team working on the film expanded from just 24 to 110 people. They hired animators, producers, artists, and computer programmers. And as the movie making got underway, the production of a single shot progressed through 5 key stages: concept art, layout, animation, shading, and lighting. And along the way, the team settled into a rhythm of art challenging the technology and the technology inspiring the art. Nowhere was this more apparent than the character animation. The level of complexity the artist needed for Woody and Buzz challenged the technical team to build an entirely new system for model building and facial muscles. The Luxo Junior lamp had only 18 movable points of control, but Woody had over 1,500 points of control that animators could manipulate to create realistic animation. The art is challenging the technology. In addition to this, working with the RenderMan software also freed the animators from previous constraints. So in traditional hand-drawn animation, animators were usually assigned to draw specific characters to ensure that they maintained a consistent look throughout the movie. But animating in a computer means you don't have to worry about this consistency. The computer model is always the same. So instead, Lasseter assigned entire scenes to an animator based on their ability to convey a certain attitude or emotion. And this improved the quality of the scenes because each animator took full ownership for their assigned scenes rather than just focusing on a single character. Here, the technology inspired the art.
I love how they're doing things differently than how they're traditionally done. And I think that's so cool how an animator would take full ownership of a single scene.
Yeah, and it really improved the quality of the final product. Now, the final step in this process was rendering. Pixar used a render farm of 117 Sun Microsystems computers that ran 24 hours a day. and each frame took between 45 minutes to 24 hours to render, depending on its complexity. The final movie included 110,000 frames for a total of 77 minutes of animation.
Yeah, this is a lot longer than the commercials that they were doing, and it's shocking how long it takes to render all that footage.
Toy Story finally wrapped production in October 1995, just weeks before its theatrical release. And to celebrate, Pixar held a wrap party where everyone dressed up and the film was screened for the first time to all 110 Pixar employees. Now, during production, it was difficult for Lasseter and Catmull to know how the film would be received by audiences. They believed they had created something great, but couldn't know for sure until it made its debut for audiences across the country. Toy Story premiered in theaters on November 22nd, 1995, and was an instant success. It topped the box office and earned back its entire $30 million production budget in opening weekend alone.
Wow, so 20 plus years in the making, Catmull and Lasseter's dream finally comes true, and it's a success. It's a huge success.
Yeah, and it went on to become the highest grossing film of the year, earning $192 million in the US and $362 million worldwide. And critics loved it too, and to this day the film has a perfect 100% score on Rotten Tomatoes. Interestingly, most reviewers hardly mentioned that Toy Story was a computer animated film. And for Ed Catmull, this was important because it meant critics had loved it as a movie, not a piece of technology. And even today, most people don't think of Toy Story as the first computer animated film, and that's a testament to its success. The computer animation was done so well that it just disappeared into the story. And Toy Story would go on to receive an Academy Award nomination for Best Original Screenplay, the first ever for an animated film. John Lasseter also received a Special Achievement Oscar recognizing Toy Story as the first feature-length computer animated film. John Lasseter had gone from a fired Disney animator to an Oscar-winning director, all because he had the courage to stick to his vision. And Ed Catmull, the kid who had given up on being an animator because he thought he wasn't good enough, finally achieved his lifelong dream of creating the first computer animated feature film. It was a massive success and forever changed the way movies are made. But it didn't come easy. It took 25 years. From that first crude 3D model of his hand at the University of Utah, to building teams at New York Tech and Lucasfilm, to that fateful meeting with John Lasseter aboard the Queen Mary. Then came the investment from Steve Jobs, the founding of Pixar, the pivot from hardware to animation, and the near fatal blow of the Black Friday screening. Through it all, Ed Catmull was successful because he had the patience to stick to his vision. Now, Stephen, I wanted to wrap up our story with a few notes on the legacy of Toy Story and what happened to Pixar and its leaders afterwards. Pixar has gone on to make 3 more Toy Story movies, with another planned for release in 2026. The Toy Story characters have become a core part of Disney and have featured in a Disney on Ice show, a Toy Story musical, video games, toys, a clothing line, and 9 different attractions at Disney theme parks. Toy Story's most lasting legacy, though, was the new generation of animators it inspired. Its release kicked off an entire era of computer animated films like A Bug's Life, Shrek, Ice Age, Frozen, and more.
And what's really amazing to me, Will, is that it seems like all movies today that come from Disney are 3D animated. We don't really see the kind of 2D drawing kind of movies anymore. So this has become the new technology, and Ed Catmull and John Lasseter pioneered that.
Yeah, like a lot of projects we've covered on this show, This was the beginning of an entirely new paradigm. After Toy Story, Pixar went on to become one of the most successful animation studios of all time. For Steve Jobs, the most important next step was to protect this special team at Pixar so they could continue to make great movies. And with this in mind, he held an IPO 1 week after Toy Story opened in theaters, and Pixar became a public company. The Pixar IPO was actually the largest IPO of 1995 and raised about $140 million. And importantly, Jobs used the capital from the IPO to renegotiate this lopsided contract with Disney and make Pixar a 50-50 partner on future films. From their first film, Toy Story, to 2006, Pixar had an unprecedented run of 7 box office hits. These included Toy Story, A Bug's Life, Toy Story 2, Monsters, Inc., Finding Nemo, The Incredibles, and Cars. And then in 2006, John Lasseter's career came full circle when Disney acquired Pixar for $7.4 billion. As part of the deal, Ed Catmull and John Lasseter took over leadership of a combined Disney and Pixar animation studios. Though Pixar still retains its independent identity and separate campus to this day.
This is an incredible story, Will, and especially for John Lasseter. I mean, he starts by getting fired from Disney, and now he returns there sort of in triumph as the president of Disney Animation Studios.
Yeah, and actually the reason Disney acquired Pixar was to reinvigorate their own animation studio.
Yeah, and with all this talent, especially Ed Catmull and John Lasseter, it sounds like they made a great decision. So Steve Jobs takes a huge risk on Pixar. He ends up investing something like $55 million of his own money from Apple just to keep the company afloat. And now it sells for $7.4 billion. So, Will, I'm curious, what ends up happening for Steve Jobs? He clearly made a great decision. What does he do next?
Yeah, so Steve Jobs, of course, returned to Apple in 1997 and released products like the iPod, the iPhone, and the iPad. But he was still closely involved with Pixar. And after the Disney acquisition, he became the largest Disney shareholder with 7% of shares. And this equated to about $3.5 billion in Disney stock. And it was actually this that made Steve Jobs a billionaire, not his money from Apple.
Wow, no kidding.
And he actually had so many shares of Disney stock that he also got a seat on the Disney board of directors.
Wow, what a triumphant moment for Steve Jobs, especially after all those years of putting in all that money, and it wasn't clear that he was ever going to get a payback.
Yeah, and I think Steve Jobs was an integral part of Pixar's success because it was only his long-term thinking that made an audacious project like this even possible. Of course, Steve Jobs would also return to Apple and go on to release many products that we know and love. He tragically passed away in 2011 from pancreatic cancer.
So John Lasseter has this huge breakout success with Toy Story. What ends up happening next?
So he went on to direct several more movies, including A Bug's Life, Toy Story 2, and Cars. After the Disney acquisition, he became the chief creative officer for Disney and Pixar Animation and the principal creative advisor for Disney's theme parks and resorts. So Lasseter was at Disney up until 2018, but he did have to leave after some allegations of sexual misconduct.
Okay, so John Lasseter isn't at Disney to this day. What about Ed Catmull?
So after the Disney acquisition, Ed Catmull became the president of a combined Disney and Pixar Animation, and he would really go on to revitalize Disney animation and produce hits like Tangled and Frozen. And in acknowledgement of his technical achievements, Catmull was awarded the 2019 Turing Award for his pioneering work on computer-generated imagery.
Oh, wow, that's huge. For those of you who don't know, the Turing Award is the highest award in the field of computer science. It's like getting a Nobel Prize of computing.
Yeah, it's a big deal. And eventually, Catmull retired from Disney and Pixar Animation in 2019. Now, this is the part of the show where we break down some of the themes and takeaways from the story. And I want to start by going back to the question that we asked at the top of the episode: how do you lead a creative project that's part art, part technology? And remember, Stephen, I gave 3 answers, and we've discussed those in detail as we told the story of Pixar and Toy Story. The first was to have the patience and courage to stick to your vision. And this reminds me of the quote we have in the intro music from Steve Jobs that says, "People say you have to have a lot of passion for what you're doing, and it's totally true. And the reason is because it's so hard that if you don't, any rational person would give up." And Catmull and Lasseter had a lot of passion for their work. They chose a specific vision, they committed to it, and it was this ability to have the patience and courage to stick to their vision that ultimately made Catmull and Lasseter successful. Catmull's 25-year journey to make the world's first computer animated film is the ultimate example of patience and long-term thinking. And Lasseter's decision after the Black Friday reels to just make the movie he wanted to make is the ultimate example of having the courage to stick to your own vision.
It's so true, Will. And these two had gone through setback after setback in order to finally achieve their dreams.
Another idea that we discussed was focusing on people over ideas. And we saw several examples of this. One was Ed Catmull's commitment to hiring people who were smarter than him. And then we saw this play out as Catmull assembled the team that was needed to make a computer animated film, but then he had to trust in Lasseter to finally deliver on that promise. And ultimately, in the end, it worked out well for him because he took the time up front to get the people right, and then the ideas followed.
Yeah, that's totally true.
And then Catmull went on to develop this idea, saying that it's not just enough to have good people, you have to have the right chemistry between those people, and you have to create an environment where they can be creative. And so I really like the way Catmull frames this idea in his book on how do you have a creative organization. And he turns this question on its head and says, the question is not how to become more creative, it's what cultural forces are getting in the way of creativity. So once you have this team of great people, you want to make sure they work well together, but then you want to remove those barriers to creativity. And Catmull says that you should start with the assumption that people are talented and want to contribute, and accept that, without meaning to, the company can stifle talent in unseen ways. And so his entire management philosophy is to identify those impediments to creativity and fix them. And for me, this idea really resonates with me, Stephen, because it's more about getting out of people's way than trying to do a top-down solution. I think sometimes we saw a little bit of this with Jeffrey Katzenberg when he was giving the notes to John Lasseter, and he had an idea for the film, and he was trying to force that on Lasseter to add more edge to the story. But really, creative processes and ideas come from a bottom-up approach. So Catmull has this great point where he says, trust in people, not processes.
I love his idea about how getting creativity is about removing those barriers and it'll flow naturally. That's such a cool way to think about it.
Yeah, I thought it was a cool idea too. And then, Stephen, our final answer to this question was to understand the relationship between art and technology. And this idea from John Lasseter that art challenges technology and technology inspires art. And there's also another great quote from Ed Catmull where he says, "You know you're an innovative company if you can't draw a line between the technical and the creative." And really the insight from Ed Catmull here and Pixar is to understand that the best output is a mix of art and technology, and they both inform each other. And I think we also saw that in the structure of Pixar and these 3 people who really made it a reality. Ed Catmull had his background mostly in computer programming, but he also had a love of animation and understood the creative side. Lasseter was mostly artistic and creative, but if you remember that example of when he created Luxo Jr., he also understood the technical tools and how the computers worked, and that ended up inspiring some of his best work. And I think Steve Jobs really encapsulates this idea of the mix of art and technology the best, because he led this high-tech company Apple that made several revolutionary technology products, but he also hired Johnny Ive to do these incredible designs for the iPhone and the MacBook that we all recognize today as really works of art in themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the whole brand of Apple is cutting-edge art and technology.
So, Stephen, we've told the story of Toy Story and by extension, Pixar. But what is your biggest takeaway? What can't you stop thinking about?
Well, what I can't stop thinking about is the parallels between the computer graphics revolution of the 90s and the generative AI revolution of today. It's clear that those same tensions still exist, where in the 90s, computer graphics sort of scared artists that they were going to kind of take some of their jobs. And we see that again today with generative AI creating entire videos, and that obviously is also quite a scary thing. I think that Ed Catmull gives a great framework for navigating these uncertain times. Don't copy what you did in the past, have a strong set of values, and use those values as a core to solve serious problems in the world.
Yeah, that's a great point. Of course, easier said than done, but I think just having a framework to work towards is a great starting spot.
Same question to you, Will. What can't you stop thinking about?
For me, Stephen, it's this idea that Pete Docter has on what makes a good director. And I want to share that quote again, but I want to paraphrase it a bit to expand it to project management and leadership in general. So the idea is something like a good leader allows a project to be something that changes and grows and adapts to the strengths of people, the strengths of technology, and all the things you have available. And I think that's just such an effective framework for understanding your job as a leader, that you're not there to give top-down direction on how to accomplish this project. You're there to adapt to the strengths of your people, the strengths of the tools that you have available, and really be flexible to deliver the best result.
Yeah, I love that point. It's like leadership is just taking the tools you have available to you, technology, people, and so on, and applying their strengths to accomplish some goal. That's it for our episode on the first computer-animated feature-length film, Toy Story.
If you want to know every time we release a new episode, join our email list using the link in the show notes. That's also where we share corrections, bonus material that didn't make it into the show, and a hint at what the next episode will be.
And if you'd like to hear more stories from Project Blueprint, help us grow by sharing with a friend who enjoys technology, leadership, or a good story.
We'd also love to hear from you. Click the survey link in the show notes to share your feedback or episode ideas.
Thanks for listening to Project Blueprint. We'll see you next time.